The night of October 30th, 1938, began as any other peaceful Sunday evening with millions of people gathered around their radios. Yet, this outward calm hid a nation still tightly in the grip of the Great Depression, and tensions were high as the threat of war in Europe loomed larger every day. Then at 8:15 p.m. came the panicked voice across the radio waves reporting of Martians that had just landed in New Jersey.
We are bringing you an eyewitness account of what's happening on the Wilmuth Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I on? Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmuth's garden. What anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Oh, Lord, they're turning into flames. Oh, the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks for the automobiles.
So alarming was the show, so realistic were its accounts of invading Martians with their deadly heat rays, that listeners by the hundreds of thousands were gripped with panic. They fled their homes, jammed highways, overwhelmed telephone circuits, flocked to houses of worship, set about preparing defenses, and even contemplated suicide in the belief that the world was ending. What began as a broadcast performance of H.G. Wells' fantasy, The War of the Worlds, turned into one of the biggest mass hysteria events in U.S. history. Or did it? Hey y'all, I'm Christina, and you're listening to History and Hearsay. On this show, we explore inspiring and sometimes dark and mysterious characters and events from history. So if that's something you're into, go ahead and subscribe, because when it comes to history, things may not always be as they appear, and on this show, you get to decide, is it history or is it hearsay? George Orson Wells was born on May 6, 1915, to his father, Richard Wells, and his mother, Patrice Wells. I'm not sure when George dropped his first name and just started going by his middle name, Orson, but since that's what he seems to be best known as, that's what we'll be calling him for the rest of this episode. Orson's father, Richard, was a successful inventor, and his mother, Patrice, was a concert pianist. With parents like that, it's no surprise that Orson's doctor declared him a prodigy at only 18 months old. It is said that as a young child, Orson quickly learned that if he wanted to avoid being banished to his nursery, then he needed to be more interesting to adults. And as a result, Orson often entertained friends and family by performing magic tricks and starring in many productions of Shakespeare. He spent his childhood being publicly recognized as a genius, and by the age of 10, Orson was already known as a cartoonist, an actor, and a poet. But despite all of his family's apparent affluence, Orson's childhood was full of hardship. When he was just 4 years old in 1919, his parents separated and moved to Chicago. During this time, Orson lived with his mom, who made a living playing the piano during lectures at the Art Institute of Chicago. But sadly, in 1924, just after Orson's 9th birthday, his mom, Patrice, died of hepatitis. The summer after his mother's death, Orson went to live with family in a private art colony, and then after that, he went to live in Chicago with his father, Richard, and Richard's roommate, Dr. Matrice Bernstein, who was a Chicago physician who had been close friends of both of Orson's parents. So then Orson goes to public school for a brief period, and then his dad, Richard, pulls him out so they can start traveling together. And then after some time traveling, they come back to Illinois, and they stay in a hotel that Richard owned. But then the hotel burns down. So then Richard and Orson hit the road again. And Richard had apparently made a fortune previously because he was the inventor of a popular bicycle lamp. And so at that point, he decided to leave business altogether and just travel full time. So he takes Orson with him, and they travel to places like Jamaica, the Far East. And there seems to be an implication here that Richard's decision to stop working and traveling full time had something to do with his drinking. But the guy owned a hotel. All alcohol aside, if I was rich enough to own a hotel, I'd probably stop working and travel full-time too. I did also read, though, that it was a small country hotel, so maybe he didn't have to be that rich to own the hotel. Regardless, though, this guy didn't seem like he was hurting for money, so I don't feel like we can automatically make a blanket statement that his decision to quit working and travel full-time was somehow related to his drinking. I couldn't find anywhere that mentioned when his drinking became an issue. However, it does sound like the drinking was an issue because Richard was described as an alcoholic playboy, and many friends of the family said it was really hard to tell who was raising who, and they felt like Orson never really got a chance to be a kid. Orson himself would later describe this time as a hectic period in his life. When Orson was just 10 years old, his dad settled down in China and sent Orson to travel Europe alone, apparently to learn self-reliance. So, on one of these solo trips to Europe, Orson finds himself in a beer garden and he's surrounded by all of these Nazis. And Orson is placed next to this guy that he would later describe as a very small man with a very dim personality. So they have lunch together, and Orson says that this guy left no impression on him whatsoever. But then years later, Orson's looking at pictures and he realizes that he had had lunch with Adolf Hitler. So that's cool. Oh yeah, send him to Europe alone. He'll be fine. It's cool. It's the 20s. He's going to learn to be a self-reliant 10-year-old. So then in 1926, Orson receives his only formal education when he's sent to the Todd School in Woodstock, Illinois. And once again, everyone's like, wow, this kid's a genius. They're like comparing him to a young Mozart because of his ability to discuss subjects like the Bible and Shakespeare at only 11 years old. But let's be honest, this kid was traveling Europe alone at 10 years old. He's no ordinary 11-year-old, at least not by today's standards. So at this point, Orson's already totally obsessed with the theater, and so he convinces his headmaster to allow him to explore that obsession, and he ends up directing and acting in a bunch of productions, which earns him all kinds of local fame and really determines and sets the course for the rest of his life. But then in 1930, when Orson is just 15 years old, his father dies and he becomes the ward of Dr. Maurice Bernstein, which, if you remember, is the guy who was his dad's roommate. So Orson continues at the Todd School until he finishes up his studies and he graduates. And then he decides that he's going to take a pre-college trip to Ireland. And he says he's going there to paint, but really he's going to audition for Dublin's famed Gate Theatre. So here he is. He's only 16 years old, but he's tall. So he lies about his age and his acting experience in order to get an audition. The owner of the theater later claims it was obvious to all of them that Orson didn't have any acting experience at all, but they must have been desperate for actors, or he was just naturally gifted because he immediately was cast in starring roles. And honestly, it sounds like Orson got a lot of experience performing for his friends and family, so I'm betting they probably just thought he was a natural, but I don't know. I wasn't there. Orson remains in Ireland for a year, acting with the company. He's designing sets, he's directing productions, and he even writes a column for the newspaper. But then in 1932, he decides he's going to leave Dublin, and he tries to get some work in London and New York, and that doesn't work out, so he just travels around for a bit. And then in 1933, Orson gets cast in a Shakespeare play, and he comes back to the United States on tour. He appears on stage in New York and starts dabbling in radio, and his deep voice almost instantly makes him an in-demand radio character. And he gets cast in his most famous radio role as the title character of The Shadow.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
The show was a huge hit, and at this point, 22-year-old Orson is so busy working on multiple shows that he hires an ambulance to rush him around between radio stations. So Orson has his friend, John Houseman, and the two of them attempt to perform a band musical, and they get kicked out of the federal theater program because it was a band musical. But the two of them are like, whatever, we don't need you guys. And they form their own theater, which they call the Mercury Theater. And this company becomes so successful that CBS hires them to produce a series of radio dramas adapted from famous novels the most famous of those being the 1938 Halloween special that we are discussing here today. So Orson gets hired to do this series of shows, right? And Orson, being Orson, just goes above and beyond and just creates this masterpiece that's like nothing that anyone has ever heard before. The program simulates a news broadcast, and Orson Wells, as its narrator, describes in breathless detail the alien invasion and the attack on New Jersey. The program opens with music.
Ladies and gentlemen, the director of the Mercury Theater and star of these broadcasts, Orson Wells.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
And then an actor portraying an announcer interrupts with a news report that several explosions of incandescent gas have occurred on Mars.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity. We now return you to the music of Ramon Raquello.
So then it goes back to music, and then it gets interrupted again. It goes back to music. And so the program includes news reports, eyewitnesses' accounts, and it really sounded so real that a lot of listeners actually panicked over what they perceived to be a real event.
What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the fires, the gas tanks for the automobiles spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill.
If you're actually interested in listening to the entirety of this hour-long performance, you can find the entire thing right here on YouTube. So I'll link that below if you guys want to go check that out. And there was even a movie made in the 1950s about the panic called The Night America Trembled, and that can be found on YouTube as well. So y'all might find that interesting too, and I'll make sure I link that also. Now, you do have to remember, radios were still pretty new in the 1930s, and they had really just started gaining popularity as a household item in the 20s and 30s. And by 1934, about 60% of households in the US had radios. So while radios were becoming more common, broadcast radio was still very new. And at that time, it was considered a state-of-the-art technology. You may also remember that the Hindenburg explosion had just happened the year before, and that had been broadcast on the radio. If you're a bit younger and you don't remember the Hindenburg, it was basically a giant blimp that exploded.
Back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flames. Get it started. It's fighting, and it's crashing terrible. Oh, my, get out of the way, please. Terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's breaking. 20. Oh.
Now, the Hindenburg event wasn't broadcast live, it was recorded live and then broadcast later that night. But many people actually thought that it was broadcast live, which here in the reporter, you can hear all of the emotions in his voice as he is experiencing it live, and it was broadcast later that same day. So I don't think it was really all that different from having actually been recorded and aired live. But if you're taking the Hindenburg into account, and you add that to the hardships of the Great Depression and the fact that the world was yet again on the brink of war, I don't think it's that big of a leap to think that some people would have been terrified after hearing yet another bad news report. Any of us who've lived through 2020, 2021, we've gotten a little taste of how it feels to have life as we know it turned upside down. There are a lot of things that I would not have believed prior to 2020, but by 2021, if you had told me that aliens had landed, I probably would have been like, meh, sounds about right for this decade. Now, it was announced at the beginning of the episode that this was a broadcast performance of H.G. Wells' novel, The War of the Worlds, but there was another popular show that was on the radio at the time, and it was said that most people switched over from that show to Orson's show about 15 minutes into the hour, and so they missed that announcement at the beginning. There is some debate on that, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. Some people who think the panic was completely real still believe it was unintentional on Orson's part because in addition to the announcement at the beginning of the program, there were also 2 clues given in the middle of the show to indicate that it was not a real news broadcast. And Orson even ended the show by letting everyone know it was basically a holiday prank.
This is Orson Wells, ladies and gentlemen, out of character, to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo. Starting now, we couldn't soap all your windows and steal all your garden gates by tomorrow night, so we did the best next thing. We annihilated the world before your very ears and utterly destroyed the CBS. You will be relieved, I hope, to learn that we didn't mean it and that both institutions are still open for business. So goodbye, everybody, and remember, please, for the next day or so, the terrible lesson you learned tonight. That grinning, glowing, globular invader of your living room is an inhabitant of the pumpkin patch, and if your doorbell rings and nobody's there, that was no Martian. It's Halloween.
By the time the show ended, the police were in the control room with Orson because they had gotten so many panicked phone calls from concerned citizens. And Orson's switchboard was flooded with angry callers from across the country. It was headline news by the next morning. Orson was basically forced to declare his innocence on a news broadcast the next morning.
Were you aware of terror at the time you were giving this role? Were you aware that terror was going on throughout the nation?
Oh, no, of course not. We did Dracula, and it seemed to me during Dracula I had high hopes that people would react as they do in a movie of that kind.
But some people think it was intentional on Orson's part. One of Orson's friends said that he was clearly acting during that press conference and that to him, Orson looked very happy with himself. Additionally, some articles claim that years later, Orson Welles himself admitted that he had deliberately done it because he was tired of people believing everything they heard on the radio.
And a lot of people wanted to know what to do. As a matter of fact, they were phoning us from all over the place, some of them reporting that they'd seen Martians landing in their backyards. The whole experience was extremely intense. I suppose we had it coming to us because, in fact, we weren't as innocent as we meant to be. When we did the Martian broadcast, we were fed up with the way in which everything that came over this new magic box, the radio, was being swallowed. People, do suspect what they read in the newspapers and what people tell them, but when the radio came, and I suppose now television, anything that came through that new machine was believed. So in a way, our broadcast was an assault on the credibility of that machine. We wanted people to understand that they shouldn't take any opinion predigested and they shouldn't swallow everything that came through the tap.
So, regardless of whether it was planned or not, this holiday special made Orson a household name. So, if it was planned on his part, I guess it worked out really well for him. He was threatened with several lawsuits, but he managed to escape prosecution, and it's claimed that he later said, "I didn't go to jail. I went to Hollywood." Now, on the other side of this, you have those who say this is all just hearsay. This supposed panic was either overhyped or a complete hoax altogether. And among this group, you also have those who believe Orson was totally innocent in this. He did, as I mentioned earlier, have 4 different times during the show where it was indicated that this wasn't a news broadcast. I mean, that part can't be disputed because that's, there's a clear recording of it. So you can go back and listen to that yourself and determine that. But, people can't really argue with that. So these people who, believe it was a complete accident, they say we should be blaming the newspapers. Radio had taken a lot of the advertising dollars from print during the Great Depression, and the newspaper industry was really hurting. They wanted to discredit radio as a reliable news source, so they sensationalized the panic to prove to advertisers that radio managers were not to be trusted. And while there were some legitimate reports of people being scared, the newspapers knew that it wasn't really as bad as they were making it out to be. So what evidence is there to prove that this entire thing was orchestrated by the newspapers? Just to make radio look bad because they didn't want to share an audience. There are actually a couple of different things that support this theory of it just being a hoax. First of all, it turns out that the majority of the radio audience wasn't even listening to Orson Welles' Halloween special. Remember how I said it was believed that many people missed the disclaimer at the beginning of Orson's program because they were watching another program and they only switched over 15 minutes in? Well, it turns out that a large portion of the audience was listening to that ventriloquist comedy variety show that I mentioned earlier, and they hadn't even switched over to Orson's program at all.
Presents the Chase and Sanborn Hour. And this is Don Amici.
It certainly is, and you're looking perfectly swell, Don.
Oh, thanks, Charlie.
That show was one of the most popular programs at the time, and there's no way of knowing if anyone would have any reason to switch over to another show in the middle. Now you might ask, how do we even know what people were listening to? Could you guys quit with the truck backing up? So inconvenient to my life. So you might ask, how do we even know what people are listening to? Well, the night the program aired, the C.E. Hooper rating service telephoned 5,000 households for a national rating survey and asked, to what program are you listening? Only 2% answered that they were listening to a radio play or the Orson Wells program or something similar that would indicate they were listening to CBS. According to the summary published of this survey, no responses indicated that they were actually listening to a news broadcast. In other words, 98% of those surveyed were listening to something else or nothing at all. And the surveyors said they actually weren't surprised by this at all because that ventriloquist show really was so popular. Now, I do feel like 5,000 isn't a huge number of people when we're talking about millions, but CBS also commissioned a nationwide survey the day after the broadcast, and that survey determined that very few people actually tuned into Orson's Halloween special. Executives at CBS must have initially been really concerned about this panic because it said that once they got the results of their survey back, they were very relieved. And Frank Stanton, who was a CBS exec at the time, was quoted as saying,
"In the first place, most people didn't hear it, but those who did hear it looked at it as a prank and accepted it that way."
In addition to the results of the surveys, there were also several eyewitnesses that documented how calm the streets were during the time when there was supposedly panic in the streets. It's also said that in the 6 weeks following Halloween, the story caught on a bit, like word of mouth style, and a lot of people started claiming that they had tuned into the show, and many stories of frightened people started popping up. And that started really feeding into the theory of, or narrative of, like mass hysteria. But it's widely believed that most of those people didn't even hear the broadcast, and it was more of a like 15 minutes of fame kind of thing, or FOMO maybe, where these people just wanted to be part of the story. Now, the contrast between how the newspaper journalists experienced the panic and what they actually reported was vastly different as well. In 1954, Ben Gross, who was the New York Daily News radio editor at the time, published a memoir in which he recalled the streets of Manhattan being deserted as his taxi sped to CBS headquarters just as the War of the Worlds program was ending. Yet that observation failed to stop the Daily News from splashing the panic story across this legendary cover just a few hours later. There were several additional accounts from eyewitnesses who said the same thing about driving down the streets, and it was basically a ghost town at the time, and there was supposed panic and rioting in the streets. These same newspapers also reported that there were several panic-related deaths and that several people were being treated for shock. But when researchers surveyed 6 New York hospitals, they all reported that they had not treated any cases specifically related to hearing the broadcast. There were no reports of death or injuries that could be found, and it appeared that the newspapers were just sensationalizing a few isolated events. Now, there was one exceptionally frightened viewer who did sue CBS for $50,000, claiming that the network had caused her nervous shock, but her lawsuit was quickly dismissed. Many also noted that the coverage of this event faded off the front pages of the newspaper just after a couple of weeks, and they're thinking that had the hysteria been this widespread, wouldn't the newspapers have kind of like milked it for a few days or even a weeks later? You know, they like to beat the dead horse sometimes, like that kind of thing. But here's the biggest question. If this really is a myth, then why has it persisted all these years? It could be a mix of things. First, you have the structure of commercial broadcasting, where broadcasting networks are trying to convince advertisers that they do retain some kind of commanding powers over their audience. After CBS determined that they didn't really scare anyone to death, they seemed to enjoy the publicity they got from it, and they regularly celebrate the War of the Worlds broadcast and its supposed effect on the public. So in 1957, they produced a dramatized series of the panic, which I believe is the one that I actually came across and that I mentioned earlier when I was doing my research. And then again in 2003, when CBS was celebrating its 75th anniversary, they actually had the War of the Worlds program as a noted highlight. So back to the structure of radio, you also have the federal regulators who are trying to persuade politicians that there exists an important protective role for the guardians of the airwaves. For both broadcasters and regulators, War of the Worlds provides excellent evidence to justify their claims about media power. Some portion of the credit, or blame, depending on which side of the story you believe, must then go to researcher Hadley Cantrell, who published a scholarly book validating the popular memory of the event. His book gave academic credence to the panic and attached real numbers to it. However, it sounds like a lot of his research was flawed, and he remains the only source with academic legitimacy who still claims that there was a sizable panic. Now, because of Cantrell's book, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but because of his book, this story of mass panic is still used to this day in some social psychology and mass communication textbook, and pretty much every high schooler and liberal arts undergraduate is going to run across it at some point, which the fact that this is so highly disputed now and it's still being taught like as unequivocal fact in schools, it just, I don't know, kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? So, why are we still talking about this 84 years later? Perhaps this story persists because it so perfectly captures our unease with the media's power. Professor Jeffrey Sconce of Northwestern suggests that the panic myth is a dysfunction of simple displacement. He suggests that it's not the Martians invading Earth that we fear, it's ABC, CBS, and NBC invading and colonizing our consciousness that truly frightens us. Sconce believes that the panic plays a symbolic function of American culture and that we retell the story because we need a cautionary tale about the power of media. And that need will never go away. Just as radio was the new medium of the 1930s, opening up exciting new channels of communication, today the internet provides us with many new channels for advancement and communication and the promise of a dynamic future without limits. But with that comes the risk of a loss of personal connections, loss of privacy, fear of censorship, having our every move tracked, and many other things that go boo in the dark. So, I was just about convinced that maybe this was all a hoax, and then I came across the interviews done with the AT&T operators.
Every light on that board lit. Now that board was, I would say, almost a half block long.
And they announced that the Martians were coming across the George Washington Bridge. And that's when the excitement started.
They were crying and screaming and wanting to know if there was a lot of gas. Is there a lot of shooting? Are there bodies all around?
But people believed it. They really believed it that night. And I think of the ones who were begging us to get connections to their families, to their husbands, to mothers and fathers before the world came to an end, so they could just tell them they loved them.
One man told me that people were jumping out of the windows and they were going to kill their families before the Martians could get them.
You see, it was not a case of answering a light and connecting them to somebody else. All they wanted was the operator. Any man that could cause that kind of upheaval in a whole country from coast to coast has got to be great.
We were exhausted when it was over with, but I look back now, I wouldn't have missed it for anything.
Do you guys think that these first-hand accounts prove that there was a legitimate panic? If nothing else, this story can serve as a reminder that you can't always trust everything you read. And if you want my opinion, I think that we all carry the weight of personal responsibility when it comes to seeking out the truth for ourselves. And on that note, I'll leave you guys with 2 words of advice. It would have been good advice 84 years ago, and it's good advice today. question everything. So, what do you guys think of this one? Is it history or is it just a bunch of hearsay? Do you guys think that the truth lies maybe somewhere in the middle? Like maybe a couple of people were scared, but then they did a bit of investigating and realized that it wasn't really happening, but they were mad that they got scared and then they like wanted to complain about it. Like, dude, you scared me. That's so rude. If you're watching this on YouTube, let us know what you think in the comments down below. If you're listening to the podcast version and enjoyed this episode, leave us a review and tell a friend. If everyone tells just one person, then this podcast will be successful. And that's really what we all want, isn't it? Thank you guys so much for listening. And don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more episodes coming soon.